You're driving down a dark road at night headed home. The cool night air grazes the top of your head as your window is slightly cracked, allowing the breeze to come in. The light from the stars in your headlights illuminate the road ahead when you suddenly think you saw it. Unusual lights moving unanimously in sequence off in the distance. No, couldn't be, could it? But suddenly, you see it again, this time even closer and brighter. It begins to follow you, and you panic. Stories of UFOs and alien abduction have been around for thousands of years, and they don't seem to be stopping anytime soon. The details and similarities in these stories are truly intriguing. Be it mysterious lights or face-to-face meetings with real aliens, these stories reveal some truly eerie encounters. Can't say for sure what happened to me that night, but here is what I know. I was driving home for the weekend from school at Indiana University. It takes me about 2 hours to get home, and I left Bloomington around 10 o'clock at night. At exactly 10:53, I am on a rural stretch of the 2-lane highway I take home, and I notice what appears to be flashing lights behind me. I thought, great, I'm getting pulled over, so I turned onto the next country road about a quarter mile from where I noticed the lights. As the car came to a stop, and I started to open my glove box to get out my registration and proof of insurance, the lights suddenly disappeared, and no car drove past. Now here is where the story takes a turn for the weird. The electronics in my car started to go haywire. The radio was randomly changing stations, and the volume kept going up and down, while the dome light and headlights start to flicker and turn off and back on. This was at 10:56. I start thinking to myself that my battery must be failing, or else I have a short somewhere in the electric system of my car. So I lean down to pop the hood so I can take a look at the battery, and that is the last thing I remember doing. The next thing I know, I open my eyes and see nothing but the night sky full of bright stars. It was a cold night, and it seemed like I had never seen stars that bright in my life. I sat up and looked around, and I saw absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. I was in the middle of a field, surrounded by corn stalks left over from the recent harvest. As I started to come to my senses, I started to freak out. Where am I? Why am I asleep in the middle of a field? Where the hell is my car? I got up and started walking toward the distant headlights I could see from a road about half a mile away. When I got to the nearest intersection, I looked at the signs which read 350N and 50W. I was half a mile away from my car, which was just right off the main road. I started walking toward the headlights I could see on the main road. I can't say how long it took me to walk the half mile, but it couldn't have been more than 10 or 15 minutes. When I arrived at my car, all the lights were out. My battery had died, which struck me as odd because I couldn't have been gone for that long. I looked at my phone, which was sitting on the passenger seat, and the time was 2:17 in the morning. Over 3 hours had passed since I turned off onto the side road for the flashing lights behind me. I remember sitting in my car completely dumbfounded, wondering what the hell had just happened to me. After about half an hour of just sitting there, I remembered that my battery was dead, so I got on the phone and called a tow truck to come out and give me a jump. It took about an hour for them to get out to me since I was a good distance away from the nearest town, during which time I just sat in silence, running through the possible scenarios in my head concerning what had just happened. To this day, I couldn't tell you what really happened to me that night. All I know is I can't think of any plausible explanation as to why I woke up over half a mile away from my car in the middle of a cornfield more than 3 hours after I had stopped. I have only shared this story with one other person, my uncle. I am sure people would either look at me like I'm crazy or they would call bullshit on the whole story, and I can't blame them. If somebody came to me with a story like that so closely mirrors the stereotypical encounter story, I probably wouldn't believe them either. I was driving back home to Los Angeles with a friend of mine after visiting family near Phoenix, Arizona. We were headed west on Highway 58, just out of Boron, California, en route to Mojave to catch the 14. It was night, and we were jamming out to some music. The next thing I know, I'm waking up, looking around and realizing that I was pulled over on the side of the road, and that approximately 3 hours had passed. My buddy was fast asleep, so I woke him up, and we both kind of had a psychological meltdown. After we calmed down a little, we went home and never really spoke of it since. I have absolutely no idea when or how we transitioned from listening to loud music and driving down the road to waking up safe on the side of the road. Back in spring of 1997, a group of us neighborhood kids were looking up at the night sky observing the Hale-Bopp comet. I grew up hours from any major city, so the view was pretty clear. After a while, we started to notice a red and a white dot circling around each other, making sudden movements in every direction, like no aircraft I have ever seen or have ever seen since. At a certain point, they merged into one craft, then shot out 3 smaller crafts, although we couldn't tell whether it was a craft because they just appeared to be balls of light. This went on for a couple hours. Right before the lights disappeared, they accelerated at lightning fast speed into the darkness. We all went home terrified of what we saw. The next day, on the front page of our small hometown paper, it said it received several calls. The explanation they gave was that the local airport was testing aircraft. I'm not sure how much I believe that story because of what I saw. To this day, whenever I see my friends that were there that night, we'll sometimes talk about it. None of us can be sure what we saw, but to this day, none of us have ever seen anything like it. October of 2009, my dad calls me and says he wants to go camping for the weekend and that he was leaving right away. This is like 4 or 5 in the afternoon. I agree. He picks me up and we head out to the Mogollon Rim. It gets dark before we get there and it rains a little bit. Very weird vibe. We pass a stranded motorist and we are usually the type to stop and help, but we decided against it. As we get close to the campsite, I see what I think is a tent with a lantern in it. It is glowing bright yellow-orange in the distance. It's a little lower in elevation than we were. As we keep driving, it doesn't seem to get any closer until it randomly moves and gets bigger. That's when we realize it isn't a tent. I tell him to stop the car, he does, and shuts off the lights. The light slowly gets bigger and kind of twists, and slowly moves from left to right. Then after about 2 to 5 minutes, it gets a little smaller, then shoots straight out to 12 o'clock until it isn't visible anymore. When it left very fast. And when it left, it lit up the forest. That's when I realized we were looking over the edge of the rim. We both agreed that we didn't know what the hell it was, and it was probably an alien. Still shook up, we got to our destination and set up camp. We had a great weekend. While I was out on a Boy Scout campout, I slept outside of a tent for the first night, as is part of the campout. At about 2:30 in the morning, I still couldn't fall asleep, and I just opened my eyes. I saw these 3 lights open up in the sky, like a perfect equilateral triangle. They just seemed to shoot down and illuminate the entire forest. At this point, everything goes quiet, like the birds, bugs, deer, and coyotes just all shut up. They moved so slowly across the sky, and I remember following them down to the pond edge. I took a couple steps into the water, and then they just kept going before disappearing. I couldn't believe it, and I told some people in the morning, and no one believed me. This was at Camp Yaguk in Rhode Island in October of 2012. I still remember those lights. They were bright enough to illuminate the entire forest, but soft enough that I just stared like a bug does at a lantern. I still refuse to sleep outside tents. I was living out in the country with my girlfriend's family when I was 19 in Eastern Canada. She went out with her friends one night, and I was alone in the house with her mom since her father worked nights. I was upstairs reading a book when the dog, who was tied up outside, started going absolutely nuts. I figured there may have been another dog on the property, and maybe they were fighting, so I ran downstairs and threw on my boots to get out there and break it up. When I flung open the door, I got goosebumps immediately. What seemed like every dog for miles around was barking, yelping, and howling. I barely had time to think about what the hell was going on when I saw an object floating above the tree line, which was probably about half a mile to a mile away. I can only describe it as a disco ball, because that's exactly what it looked like. It was round and about the size of a pencil eraser from that distance. It would float to the left and right, and slightly up and down. It would do this for maybe 10 seconds, and then disappear. It would reappear a second later in a different spot. It did this probably 6 times, enough that when it disappeared, I would start scanning the tree line to see where it would reappear next. It was completely silent. I ducked my head in the door at one point and saw that my girlfriend's mother was asleep on the couch. I didn't want to go inside and rouse her for fear of missing it. The last time the thing disappeared in the exact spot, it blinked out a teardrop-shaped light that shot straight down and behind the tree line extremely fast. I stood there for a second trying to figure out if I'd actually seen this or maybe was hallucinating, and almost on cue, as if to give me proof that I had seen it, I heard voices and looked to the road and saw that a couple had stopped their car and had been standing on the side of the road watching the very same thing I had been seeing. I didn't hear actual words, but there was clearly surprise in their voices. I thought about going down to the road to talk to them, but it was quite a ways off, and I was in my pajamas. Before I really had a chance, they drove away. Back when I was an undergrad, I had a couple buddies who were big stargazers. One of them lived in a remote part of eastern Washington, where you could see everything clearly away from the light pollution. He invited me and another friend to visit his family for Thanksgiving one year, and we said yes. One night we went out into a field of knee-high grass and were looking up at the sky. It was really neat, and we saw a bunch of shooting stars. My friend suddenly pointed to a bright light in the sky and asked what it was. My other friend, the one interested in astronomy, didn't know. It looked kind of like a planet, but evidently there shouldn't have been any visible planets that night. It didn't really move, but it bobbed in the sky, kind of bouncing up and down. Then, like a candle or something, it fizzled out. It literally looked like it burned up. That would have been weird by itself, but that wasn't the weirdest part. We sort of thought nothing of it, and were actually joking about seeing a UFO, when we came across a guy in the middle of a field. I still have no idea how he got there, since we could see pretty far in all directions and would have noticed him walking around. He was youngish, pretty much our age. He wasn't wearing any shoes or a shirt, and as far as I could tell, was only wearing jeans. He was sitting curled up, with his arms wrapped around his knees, and shivering. Keep in mind, it was the end of November, so no one would ever go out without a shirt, much less a jacket. We were scared to approach him, so we asked from afar if he was okay. He sort of stared at us blankly and said he was fine. He didn't sound drunk, but you could hear in his voice that he was cold. Eventually, we went over to him and asked how he got there. He said he didn't want to talk about it and that he needed to go to the hospital. My friend called 911, and some cops showed up with an ambulance at a nearby gas station we all walked to. I let him borrow my coat while we waited. He didn't really say anything, except he asked for our names and what we were doing. He also asked my friend about a couple constellations. The cops asked us a few questions, and paramedics took the dude away. I let him keep my jacket. My friend told the story to his family the next morning, and I remember I had forgotten all about the light. He made that connection though. His family thought it was spooky, but figured we just had a run-in with a junkie. When I was a kid, I lived right on the edge of the state forests. My friends and I would go adventuring out there all the time, and as we got a bit older, middle school age, we started camping and just going for hikes to unwind. One night, I went out for a walk by myself on a trail I could navigate with my eyes closed. I left my house around 8 at night. I sat down in a small clearing after about 20 minutes of walking and stared up at the stars, at what I thought was an airplane until I realized it wasn't moving but slightly pulsing. I could feel the pulses in my chest like they were synced up with my heartbeat. I just kinda shook it off after maybe 15 minutes as a weird coincidence and hopped up to meander my way home. When I got home, all the lights were off, which I found kinda weird until I went to plug my phone in. It was 2 in the morning. This is a family story I've heard only twice, and it was a few years ago, so I don't remember all the little intricacies. They live in Ukraine, but took a trip to Turkey sometime in the 90s. They had rented a little cottage there that was far enough into the countryside to be considered fairly remote. Long story short, one evening the dogs outside started going absolutely crazy, barking viciously, and just overall behaving erratically. My grandma's brother went outside to check what was going on, and saw what they can only describe as a UFO nearing their cottage, pretty high up in the sky, but lowering a bit as it came closer. He called for the rest of the family to come and see, and to this day they can still confirm what they saw. Well, the ones that are still alive at least. They said it was triangle-shaped and had 3 lights, one in each corner. When it got seriously close to the house, they really began to panic and ran back inside. The very walls were shaking. Dishes were breaking from the force of the vibrations going throughout the walls and floor, and the dogs outside were barking louder than ever. It hovered over the cottage for several minutes before ascending back up and disappearing. These are all people who are very conservative and rational, and they hate discussions regarding the supernatural, so I have no doubt in my mind that they were telling the truth. I was an air traffic controller tower in the Air Force. One morning, I think it was 1972, I was the crew chief on duty on a midnight shift along with one other controller. It was daybreak and almost time for shift change when I looked up, and there's a metallic object crossing over the field. Randolph, AFB, Texas, and moving fast. I couldn't make out what it was, but I knew for sure it wasn't an aircraft. I called down to radar and asked if they had anything on their scope, and they replied, no. The other person who was working with me was sleeping on the floor since it was slow. No traffic at all. All these years later, I still wonder what it was, but it raised the hair on the back of my neck when I was watching it. One night, I go down to the kitchen to drink water at about 4 in the morning, and I heard this weird kind of low-pitched buzzing sound coming from outside. I go out to the backyard and see this bright rounded object hovering about 600 feet right above me. I just froze there. I almost felt like I was paralyzed for a moment. I watched it ascend higher into the air and take off at an incredible speed and disappear into the wintry clouds. That night, I had a dream that I was abducted. Now when I think about it, I wonder if the dream was real, but was purposely made to seem like a dream. Edre, West Virginia. One night a few years back, my friend, who is driving, and I had just dropped off his girlfriend, and we decided to take the long way home. As we are driving along this fairly deserted back road, I begin to zone out, and I stare at this blinking red light off in the distance and casually think to myself, I wonder when they built a cell phone tower all the way out here, when suddenly it blinks and is dramatically closer than it was just a moment earlier. At this point, my friend points it out and stops in the road. It blinks once more and is directly in front and over top of us. The red light is so bright it floods the car in a deep scarlet hue. I lean forward so that I can see directly into the light. In that brief moment, I feel a flood of negative emotions. The closest description I can offer is to that of being naked under a giant microscope and having every pore examined thoroughly. I then look away from the light to my friend and ask him to drive. He barely responds, apparently in a similar state. Then he snaps out of it and starts driving. As we get a little ways down the road, I notice the red light isn't fading, and the interior of the car is still clearly lit by it. I look out the window, and to my horror, the light is following us and does so for approximately 2 miles. The light unexpectedly veers off to the left and comes down to ground level in a patch of trees adjacent to the road. My friend stops the car again and continues to stare at it, and abruptly declares he is going to get out and look at it like he is in some sort of trance. He opens the door, and I grab his arm and tell him if he does, I will get in the driver's seat and leave him, that we had to leave that instant. He looks at me and seems to come to and punches the gas so hard the tires lose traction and spin. The light remains stationary as we rode away, but I've never looked at the night sky the same. I was traveling back home with my mom from my aunt's house on a warm, sunny afternoon. While I was sitting in the passenger seat, an object just appeared in the sky, a little to our left. We both saw it immediately. The size of it is what was shocking more than anything. It had the classic saucer shape and was shining brightly because the sun was reflecting off of it. We continued driving down the road a few seconds, just admiring this craft, when all of a sudden we saw something I still don't believe to this day. It just vanishes, disintegrates, disappears, whatever you want to call it. I looked back at my mom, and I could tell by her expression she had seen the same thing. I've seen a couple of weird lights occasionally, and I have no recollection of being abducted, but when I was 12 or so, I felt something hard and round in my earlobe. I told everyone, and they said it was just an under-the-skin zit, pretty normal for someone my age. But it was there for 6 months. Annoyed, I decided to do some self-surgery. I could feel it very near the surface and poked a hole in my ear with a sterilized needle. Blood everywhere. I could feel this thing, and I squeezed up towards the hole I just pierced. Out pops this tiny metal ball, maybe half the size of a BB. It was black metal, completely spherical, with an indentation around the center, and teeny tiny golf ball-like indentations. As I was rolling it around in my blood-covered fingers, it slipped, spun around the sink a couple of times, and fell down the drain. At 12, I had no idea what the hell to do with it, and my parents didn't believe a word I said and told me to just put some tea tree oil on my zits next time. I have never had anything like it since. (1997) Colorado Springs. I was 8 years old, playing in the sand volleyball court at the park down the street from my house. I was engrossed in my activity, burying my collection of Happy Meal toys in the sand, and then digging them back out. Repeat. I was looking down, but decided suddenly that I needed to look up because the world around me had lost all sound. There was no longer any ambient noise. No traffic noise from the busy streets just a block over. No more dogs barking. No more birds chirping. I looked at the street that bordered the park, and that is when I saw it. It looked like a stealth bomber turned sideways, nose leading, one wing down toward the road, and the other pointed up at the sky. Completely shiny black in color, as tall as a house, shaped like an arrowhead. It was cruising the street at 3 miles per hour, just gliding over the road. I watched it for maybe 20 seconds. As soon as it passed behind some 2-story houses and out of my sight, I got my hearing back full force. I ran home and never spoke a word of it to anybody. I was standing in my driveway smoking a cigarette listening to my iPod somewhere around 2 in the morning. I decided to pause my iPod to turn on the backlight, waved my hand over it a couple times, making somewhat of a strobe pattern. I didn't hear anything. I didn't see anything come up, but I got that being watched feeling. I looked up, and directly above me was a trapezoid-shaped craft with rounded edges that had a dark red and black pulsating glowing outline. It was like flowing electricity. It was not even 75 feet up. I could have hit this thing with a rock. I stood there while it hovered directly above me, completely silent for maybe 10-15 seconds, while it made this kind of motion similar to the ball that Luke trained with in Star Wars. It hovered side to side, front to back in a smooth motion, never getting more than 20 feet away from its original position. It was extremely fascinating, but I was frozen stiff. After those few seconds, I waved one hand at it in a friendly manner. It then changed light pattern and hovered away behind my house. Upon deeper inspection, the fact that it knew that I saw it, but made no effort to evade my detection, makes me think it wanted me to follow it, although I was too freaked out to think about that at the time. First and foremost, thank you for listening and for your continued support on the channel. It is so deeply appreciated, and I greatly enjoy connecting with every one of you. If you enjoyed these stories and want to hear more unnerving tales, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss any upcoming videos. Share this video with your friends and comment below. Which of these eerie tales gave you the creeps and chills? Have you experienced any supernatural occurrences? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section.